Hi, Missladypetal here. I've been asked by some of my subscribers to actually do a basic paintbrush tutorial. So what kind of paintbrushes are there, what are the different types, and what are they actually specifically used for? So I've decided to just do a little bit of a tutorial, and I'll keep it pretty short and sweet. By far the most common of all the brushes is a round, and I'll just pop this in the water so that you can kind of see its form well. Okay, so this is a round brush, and you can see it has a slightly pointy tip, but not really excessively over exaggerated, and it's good for sketching, outlining detailed work, controlled washes, it's filling in small areas, and it creates thick to thin lines, thin at the tip and becoming wider the more it is pressed down. So use with thinned paint rather than thick paint. So I've got some paint here, and I'm just going to start lightly and then gradually. Alright, so it gives you that thin to thick, and it's also one of those ones where you can start off with a point and then press down to get a kind of a petal effect, particularly when you're doing folk art. And it just, for wide painting, it is probably the most used brush of all the 8 and the most common and widely available, the round brush. Okay, so the next one is the pointed round. So have a look at this. This is a large, it's a number 16, very big. And you can see the excessive point that it's got. So it does the same sort of thing, but it's narrower than the round pointed. It's more heavily tapered, and it's good for finer details and lines, delicate areas, spotting and retouching. So if I'm to load this up with paint and do the same test, it would start at a finer point before it went to the thick. And the other thing too is with these points, you can do finer lines than you can with the round. And that's a number 16 brush and very fine lines, or you can make them thicker. But they will always look thin at both ends and thicker in the middle when you do that. If I was to just do the round brush for its fine point, it's not nearly as fine, and that's a number 8. Just gives you an idea of the different controls you have with each of those brushes. The next one I'm going to do is a flat. So the flat, and this one has slightly longer bristles, right? But this is also a flat, and it has slightly shorter bristles, and the bristles are far stiffer in this particular one. This is a Dina Wakley brush, and I absolutely love it for the stiff bristles. And this one is a Taklon brush. They're both synthetics. You can get all different types. This is a 1/2 inch flat. Now the flat has a square end with a medium to long hairs, and some are longer than others, to be honest. Now the shorter they are, the more control you have. The longer they are, the less control you have. They are good for bold strokes, washes, filling wide spaces, impasto. Impasto is an additive that you use to acrylic paints to give it body and life, and to have bold brush strokes that are 3D. I recently did my autumn flowers painting, and I used a lot of impasto in that, and it makes it look like oils when it's finished, because acrylic paint will actually shrink down as the water evaporates out of it, because it is a plastic. The impasto is what gives it the body and stops it from shrinking down. You can use the edge for fine lines, straight edges and stripes. Long head flat brushes are ideal for varnishing. So if I'm going to look at the actual brush stroke, it's like a a long, nice fluid. If I was to have that watery or use it in watercolor, I would be doing a wash with it. And you would have your bead and you would basically use the bristles to have less strokes in the wash so that it was a nice even wash. Now you can also use these to create lines, and when I do that I make it moist, squeeze the water out of it, and I make it go to a very sharp point. You see the sharp point before I will attempt, and then I will dab it in the paint and do my lines. And so you're getting the lines very much along the line, but if you then can have some further detail like with calligraphy. So the bright brush. Now the bright brush is the only one I actually don't have, but it looks something like this, and it looks like it has shorter bristles like that. So it's very much along the lines of this Dina Wakley brush, but imagine it being very chiseled in with shorter bristles. And the reason that it does that is so that it's good for short controlled strokes and thick heavy colour. So it's designed to hold a lot of paint, for the bristles not to be bent by the amount of paint that you have, and it then is better for working up close rather than holding the brush at a distance from the canvas. And look, I haven't had the need to get one yet, but they're actually a little bit different, you know, like they're not as readily available, they're not as used as much, but it's definitely on my to get list. So if you're then using thick paint with it, you would load it up and it would have bright bold strokes. I can't demonstrate it any better than that because I don't actually have one, but I have used them and they are quite similar to that. And I'm using a translucent poster paint, so it's not really thick, because I want to be able to see the definition. I want you to see the definition in the strokes. Alright, the next one that I'm going to talk about is the filbert. So the filbert is a flat or oval brush. Let me just get my filbert out. So it's a flat or oval brush. And it has flat and oval shaped end with medium to long hairs. That's long. I would consider that long. I have other filberts that are shorter, but they do tend to have longer hairs, I find, than the round. So there's a smaller one, and again it's pretty long in the hairs. And the filbert is really good for blending soft rounded edges like flower petals. This brush is sort of a combination of all the rounds and all the flats, because it can cover, because it can be used for detail, but it can also cover more space than a round. Like it has better coverage than a round. So I'm going to use the small here. And to give you an idea, you can see the rounded edges when we're doing straight lines. But you can also see, if I was to do the rounded edge and compare it to the round at the top, I would start, press, and it would have greater coverage than the rounds because it can hold more paint. I use the filberts a lot for flowers and blending flesh tones in faces. I find that the rounded tip is really good for the round spots in faces, and so my filberts I specifically bought, particularly this one, and I have a couple of others, to actually blend with those beautiful even strokes, and then you don't eventually see the strokes at all. You blend those flesh colours together for faces. Okay, so I have an angle. So this is an angle brush, and it's flat with angled hairs at the end. It's good for curved strokes and filling corners. It can reach small areas with the tip. It can also be used to cover lots of space, similar to flat brushes. When I'm doing graffiti painting, I tend to use angle brushes more than any other brush. Why? Because I get those beautiful angular points, and when I talk points, I mean it can really hit a beautiful point. I love the fact that I can create a triangle with one stroke, so if I'm trying to do an edge like that, it's just gorgeous. You find that there are many different uses for the angle brush, and it can be applied in many situations, but the situation I love it for the most is that beautiful, beautiful sharp point that you get. And your brush can't be heavily loaded to get that sharp point, but you cannot get that from a flat brush. Ever. You will never get a sharp point from a flat brush, so the angle brush is the way to go. If you ever want to do something that's more exact and has beautiful sharp points, and that's why I use it. A detail round. Now a detail round, I just call them detail brushes. I use these, to be honest with you, I use these mainly for ink, so you can see that's really thin. You can see that that's really thin, and you tend to do finer details with it, like on faces or drawing, or so when I use a detail brush, I will look at fine lines, and it's almost like using an ink pen. I'll just bring this in. But I can tell you now, when I'm using these with paint, I tend to use them with more inks than paint. When I'm using them for paint, I'll use them for dotting and adding finer details, or creating very light shading. You can still load them up a lot. They are quite deceptive with what they can be loaded with, and they can be blended out quite well, but they are mainly for finer details. If you flatten them out, you can actually get a bigger line than your pointed round at the top, because they're not tapered really that much at all. They're tapered a little bit, but not a lot. Now the final one that I'm looking at is the fan. So the fan brush is a specialist brush, and it can be used a number of different ways. So it's good. The natural hairs in it are good for smoothing, so if you get them with natural hairs, they're good for smoothing, blending and feathering. Synthetic hairs are better for textural effects like clouds and leaves on trees. And for acrylics, use a strong and sturdy one, otherwise the hairs will clump when the paint is added. So this is a more of a watercolor one. It's synthetic, and the bristles are soft. They are not stiff. And I would say with the fans that are stiffer, they've got a natural kind of, this kind of a bristle. They are what we're talking about when we're looking at the textural effects for clouds. This particular fan I use to create strokes like grass. So I will create grass, so you can see that grass effect. And I do that on big acrylic paintings because I actually want that to separate out. If I was going to use this where it didn't separate out, I would be using it with watercolors. I don't actually have the more stiff one, because to this point I actually haven't needed it, but the moment that I do, I will get one. They are not that expensive, and you can use them for a number of different purposes. But for now, I've just got, just pretty much used the one fan brush. And I love the fact that you can do get that mini brush look. Can you imagine if I was doing hair on an animal, that you would see all those fine brush strokes. So that's a basic tutorial on brushes. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to know any other things, tips and tricks, then just put your questions on any of my videos in the comments and I will do a Technique Friday. Ciao for now. Learn something new today. Keeps you young.